A man who was getting on in age decided it was time to move to a place where he could get some assistance for his daily needs. He was always an independent person. He was retired from being a CEO of a company he built. He was on the boards of several companies and gave freely to charities. He was a popular man in the community and was recognized wherever he went. But he realized he could no longer live independently, so he moved to a senior community. One of the first days he was there, he decided to go to the gathering room and meet some of the residents. There were several ladies sitting at a table, and he approached them and introduced himself. The ladies were not impressed and did not acknowledge his presence more than a nod. He was taken aback and said, "Ladies, do you know who I am?" After a moment, one of the ladies politely turned to him and said, "No, but if you go to the front desk, they can tell you who you are." How do we feel when our sense of who we are is questioned or not acknowledged? Jesus may have felt like the gentleman in this story, as he too was questioned about who he was in our gospel today. Worse yet for Jesus, it was his own family and friends, those he grew up with, who were questioning him. Jesus did not give in to their faithlessness. He continued to work among them, even though he was not able to perform the types of miracles that he had done in other places. Could it be that Jesus was so shaken by these people that he was unable to fulfill his ministry? Or could it be it was the people themselves being faithless or being non-believers? They too have a part in this. As non-believers, they could not recognize who Jesus was, and maybe because they just chose not to. Jesus could not even prove to these people who he was because they took him only for a carpenter's son. They were locked into a faithless belief, one that would not change even when Jesus did perform miracles. And in our second reading, Paul talks about a thorn given to him so that he may not be too elated. Possibly a thorn was given to Jesus' doubters as well, so as not to allow them to be boastful or elated because of whom they were associated with. It can be reflected in this story of golf immortal Arnold Palmer. He said, "It was the final hole of the 1961 Masters tournament, and I had a one-stroke lead and had just hit a very satisfying tee shot. I felt I was in pretty good shape. As I approached my ball, I saw an old friend standing at the edge of the gallery. He motioned me over, stuck out his hand and said, 'Congratulations.' I took his hand and shook it, but as soon as I did, I knew I had lost my focus. On my next two shots, I hit the ball into a sand trap, then put it over the edge of the green. I missed a putt and lost the Masters. You don't forget a mistake like that. You learn from it and become determined that you will never do that again. I haven't in 30 years since." Now, in the first reading, Ezekiel was told he was being sent to a rebellious people. Ezekiel would walk the streets telling of God's message. Just the fact that he was a street preacher tells us how difficult his task was, especially if we think of how some of us feel when we are approached by someone preaching about God on the streets today. God told Ezekiel that not only are the ones he would be preaching to rebelled against God, but their ancestors rebelled against God as well. God was telling Ezekiel he had to be steadfast, not to let them sway him away from what he was trying to do or who he was. Because even though they would resist, they still would realize that a prophet was among them. It may not seem like it at the time, but the Israelites would come to know that Ezekiel, by way of his steadfastness, he told them what God was and had put in his mouth, so nothing could shake him. Paul. Paul knew he would be questioned as to his authority, just as Jesus was questioned. So Paul faces this head on and tells the people all about this weakness of his, not letting it get in the way of what he knows God would want him to say, and how it may not be accepted or listened to. Now, we really don't know if this thorn he spoke of was physical, something people could see, or emotional, what people couldn't see but would still judge him on. But to Paul, it didn't matter. What mattered to Paul was that he showed he was steadfast in his beliefs, in his faith. This is where we are like Paul, as we all have our thorns that we do not want people to see. We may be embarrassed, so we work to hide it from others. It may even stop us from moving forward in our plan for our life. Paul asked God to relieve him of this thing, but was told that this is what needs to be done to keep Paul from being a prideful self, and that would not allow him to keep that steadfastness he needed to God. It was to give him the strength to rise above the negativity of others and to keep him focused on what the ultimate goal was. We too may be living with a thorn or a stigma, which may keep us from totally fulfilling the plan that is made for us. We too need to stay steadfast to our God, regardless of what that thorn may be. Sometimes it's that thorn that propels us forward. It's possible Ezekiel would not have taken up the chore laid before him had he not had the belief he could overcome whatever it was that held him back. He took to the streets in a humble approach, as opposed to teaching in the synagogues that the rabbis would do. Paul knew that this thorn of his that gave him pause to think may hold him back, but he kept moving forward. He had that strength not to falter. He had to have that belief that God would not let him falter. At the same time, he had the presence of mind to realize he was not to become too proud, because then he could not get his message across despite any defect that he had. He knew he had just to stand firm because God would support him. And finally, we think again of Jesus and why he would fit into this group with Ezekiel and Paul. I don't think he does. We have to look at it from the other side. It was not Jesus that had the thorn or the flaw. It was those people around Jesus. They seemed to have that flaw. They did not allow themselves to be accepting of what Jesus had to say. He was steadfast in himself, but the people were the reeds swaying in the wind. So this gives us some insight into ourselves. When we are the proclaimers, we must look past our thorn. And when we are the hearers of the truth, we need to recognize the truth and be open to the truth. Our readings today show us both those sides.